You can't. We had it a lot, didn't we, with the coronavirus call-in, where we'd say, "Oh, we've got these 6 callers," but one caller would be like, "We need to spend time," you know.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. I mean, that's the story of my life as well. I mean, very much in medicine, there are some people who come in and you don't know what's going to come in through the door, and some people need a bit more time, and some topics need a bit more time, and it's a very fraught time for many young people. I will say one thing, actually, which is that when I was 17, I remember turning up to my university interviews and that kind of thing, and I applied to Cambridge. I mean, I'm employed by Cambridge University. I went to Cambridge University as a medical student, but not initially, and it did change my life. It's an amazing place with amazing people, but when I first applied, I got rejected. And what we know, I could have thought to myself, "Wow, that's the end of my life." But in fact, they unknowingly did me the most amazing favour, because I actually went to what was then the London Hospital Medical College, which was in Whitechapel. It had linked up with St Bartholomew's Medical School and had been absorbed into what was then called Queen, which is now one of our best universities. And I had the most amazing education. They had revamped the whole of the way they were teaching medicine. And medical program running, and they came to me. And so, because I'd done pretty well, and they saw a good thing when they saw it coming, and so they said, "Well, have that." And then I moved to Cambridge, and so I ended up back in the year with all the students did go there instead of me, and I thought, I'm really overawed. I'm probably going to get wiped the floor with, and actually it was the other way around, and I knew that's because I've been so well taught at Queen Mary University of London and UCL. I had the most amazing education, and I made some fantastic friends. And the most important thing, Colin, do you know what the most important thing, apart from a first-class honours degree I got from University College London, was?
I'm going to say you met your wife.
Hit the nail on the head. I got a wife out of that, and what an amazing asset.
You get a wife. You met your wife.
I'm so
you
lucky.
Get a wife, Chris.
Yeah,
I got an amazing.
I met the most amazing person, and that wouldn't have happened. So Cambridge University, thank you so much on so many levels for everything you've done for me, including finding me my wife, or helping me find my wife, making the path open to me to find my wife, and to make some wonderful friends who remain my friends. The people who taught me at those universities remain my friends today. They're all a bit older these days and a bit wrinklier. But I'm not, of course. I still in touch with some of those people, and it was wonderful. So it's a wonderful time. Once you get on the right path with your education, it's amazing, and it does change your life. And I was the first person in my family to go to university.
Yeah.
And it really does change your life.
Quite passionate you are, but that's why I love having you on. This isn't even what you're on to talk about, and it's brilliant. And just all the things you said, is you're right, you never know what's going to happen. You met your wife at university, and I'm just glad I met her a couple of years earlier. But the point I'm making is that your life takes twists and turns everywhere, Dr. Chris. As an adult,
well, that's what you were just saying, Tyler, I heard you say that, and it struck a chord with me, because I then immediately thought, well, you're urging them to be receptive to the fact that life is going to be full of twists and turns. And, one of the best quotes, I was actually talking to Rick Wakeman, keyboard man, and he wrote his autobiography called It Say Yes for obvious reasons. And in there he said he heard a station playing when he was on tour in America somewhere, and he heard one of the people on the station say, "There is no such thing as luck. Luck is when opportunity meets preparation." Yeah. And he said he made that one of his sort of life monikers, and I've done exactly the same thing. It's all about being prepared, and when you see an opportunity, you go for it. And life's full of those opportunities, and it's easy to take the safe route all the time. Sometimes you just need to jump out of your chair and take a risk, and be prepared to take some of those risks, because it opens the most amazing doors.
And when you're 18, and everyone knows this, if you're listening, you're 18, you're 28, you're 48, you're 68, life will just keep slapping you in the face in various moments, and you've got to smooth around it. Well, listen, on the subject of twists and turns, no bigger one in recent times than the coronavirus, of course, than COVID-19. So we have a full half hour to talk about after the news and sport. We'll talk about, I've had so many things written down, 27 vaccines are in phase 3 now, over 100,000 people have signed up for vaccine trials. gatherings. Did you see the top of Ben Nevis? We stopped giving kids all the blame for this, going to parties. How do you actually vaccinate 7 billion people? These are just some of my questions. You'll have others. It's 85058. Doctor is with us. Chris Smith, the Naked Scientist, and we will have a chat to him when we come back very, very shortly with your news and sport on BBC Radio 5.
On digital, BBC Sounds, smart speaker and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
With the 5 Live News, I'm Jonathan Keith. The Education Secretary Gavin Williamson has announced that A-level and GCSE students in England will be given grades estimated by their teachers after complaints that the original method used had been unjust. The new system had to be introduced after exams were called off because of the coronavirus pandemic. But Mr Williamson acknowledged that the controversial algorithm had caused significant inconsistencies. He also apologised to students for the distress caused. Similar announcements have also been made in Wales and Northern Ireland. Kent County Council says it's unable to safely care for any more child migrants after a recent rise in the number of under-18s arriving alone. More than 400 children, most of whom have arrived in Dover by small boat, have entered the authorities' care so far this year. The council says the responsibility should be shared across England. A woman's been remanded in custody after appearing before magistrates in West London charged with the murder of her 10-year-old son. Olga Freeman, who's 40, will appear at the Old Bailey on Wednesday. And more than 70 staff at the Reserve Factory in Nottinghamshire have tested positive for COVID-19. The company have said they will continue testing all people who work at the site in Newark. In sport, Barcelona...
Да, люблю я иногда так похулиганить.
Of Europa League matches, Inter Milan thrashed Shakhtar Donetsk 5-0 to reach the final. The Italian team go on to face Sevilla in Friday's match in Cologne. Manchester City legend David Silva has joined La Liga side Real Sociedad on a 2-year deal. Silva's 10-year stay at City ended on Saturday after their Champions League quarter-final defeat to Lyon. Unsurprisingly, the weather-affected second test between England and Pakistan ended in a draw. Rain meant play didn't get underway on the final day until 3:20, after which England reached 110 for 4 declared in reply to Pakistan's 236. England will take a 1-0 lead into the third and final test, which begins on Friday at the same ground. World number 2 Simona Halep is the 6th top 10 women's player to withdraw from tennis's US Open. She says it's to protect her health. The Grand Slam is set to get underway behind closed doors in 2 weeks' time in New York. And the Washington football team have appointed Jason Wright as their new president, making him the NFL's first black team president.
Available now on BBC Sounds.
In the Greatest Fights podcast, Steve Bunce and I watch classic bouts in the company of some of the biggest names in boxing. A series of history-making showdowns, occasions when reputations were made on nights never to be forgotten. Alongside Sugar Ray Leonard, we relive his monumental first fight against Tommy Hearns. Evander Holyfield explains to us what was going through his mind against Mike Tyson in the infamous bite fight, and we hear the likes of Ricky Hatton recalling every high, every low in his unforgettable battle against Kostya Tszyu.
The Greatest Fights podcast with Mike Costello and Steve Bunce.
Listen now on BBC Sounds.
Colin Murray, Monday to Wednesday, 10:30 till 1 on 5 Live.
And we are in surgery with my very own Blondie, Doc. I'm talking to our A-level students. So let's get firing straight in. Right, I think last time we talked only 3 vaccines were in phase 3. It's 7 now.
Yeah, we're 23 in total in clinical trials somewhere. Clinical trials obviously could mean phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3, but there's certainly a lot of irons in the fire. Around the world, we've now notched up something like 170 independent vaccine projects, and we're seeing an unprecedented, because that word's getting used a lot, isn't it, level of interaction between different pharmaceutical companies that normally would be arch frenemies in the pharmaceutical space, and they're actually teaming up to bring different things to the party, although socially distanced party, of course. in order to bring these vaccines to market. And we're talking hundreds of millions of doses being commissioned from these different companies. Britain, we think, is out there in front, leading the way in terms of the drive for a vaccine. We've got two very promising candidates in the UK, one from the University of Oxford, one from Imperial College. My own university, Cambridge, has got various groups actually working on different vaccine initiatives. They're going for a sort of longer burn thing, because most people are thinking about vaccine done, dusted here and now, but actually there's a much bigger picture to consider. And you alluded to this, Colin, before the news when you said the 7 billion number. You know, probably there's more like 7.5 billion people on Earth, and we're going to have to get to everybody, because as Melinda Gates from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has very accurately pointed out, if COVID's anywhere, it's everywhere. We've got to solve this global problem with a global solution, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. The kind of vaccine we get to launch in the UK, which will protect your average UK person, is probably not going to be the best vaccine to distribute into resource-poor, infrastructure-poor settings in the third world. So we need to have horses for courses here. So it's very important we've got a range of different offerings, and you know, the success rate is about 10% for any kind of pharmaceutical. So having lots of irons in the fire is very important.
Ignorant question alert from me. Does blood type affect vaccine? I have no idea. I only asked this guy recently, found out I got one of the two rare ones.
Ah, right. Well, I'm O negative, which I think puts me in under 15% of the population, so I'm pretty rare as well.
AB positive, is it 1%?
Which one?
AB positive.
Oh, group AB is. You're a little bit more common than me, but
really,
in blood groups that is. But well, O negative.
Да, я знаю, что мне не нужно туда заезжать, но я туда заеду, но не ради того, чтобы взвешиваться, а просто чтобы открыть эту область, потому что я хочу, чтобы у меня все было жёлтенькое.
So you can give my blood to anybody, but my body is very fussy. It will only have group O negative blood, otherwise I'm in trouble. But in terms of your response to a vaccine, this shouldn't make a difference. Okay. But it does appear to make us virus. It's a modest effect, but it's not zero. People have actually looked at the representation of blood groups in the population. We know what the frequency of Group A, Group B, Group AB, Group O is. And you can then say, well, if we look at people with severe coronavirus in intensive care, do we see the same representation of blood groups there in line with general population? Or are some groups coming up more often? And the answer is they are. Group A is coming up a bit more often than you would expect on the basis of how common it is in the population, and Group O is coming up correspondingly less
Нет,
than you would
мужик, я
expect
тоже
based
проеду.
on its
Пропусти
representation
меня.
in the general population. So the conclusion we draw is that Group A is a bit of a risk factor, and Group O is a bit protective. But the numbers are not huge. It's a 10% or less than 10% shift in each direction. But even so, it's interesting because it says, well, something about the blood group, or more likely, the bit of your DNA that codes for your blood group nearby wherever the blood group's getting coded. Perhaps there's some other gene.
Напоминаю, что сегодня я, так сказать, дооткрываю те, у меня получается сколько, 4 города, которые еще не открыты, по-моему, 4 или 5, ну что-то около того. Открывать карту сейчас влом. И сейчас я доведу груз, а после этого я, конечно, попытаюсь найти что-нибудь такое, чтобы рядом, и можно было бы его туда доставить по назначению. Но, скорее всего, его там не будет, и я туда поеду просто так. Для того, чтобы просто, черт возьми, его открыть. Кадровых агентств там, конечно, нет, но я люблю, чтобы у меня все было открыто. И вот когда их я уже открою, вот тогда я буду ездить в долгие рейсы, за которых платят по 100 тысяч баксов. Тогда уже можно будет по-человечески начать, что называется, играть. Молодец, чувак, уже 11 тысяч зарабатывает.
Yes, she's quite right that
Ну,
this
давай
is sort of what I
посмотрим,
was
что ты
just
там
alluding to when I
повысил.
said about Melinda Gates's quote, which I've used a lot, and I think it's a very good one. But going back to that point, The vaccine that will be elaborated for this country, very likely it'll be something like what Oxford University are working on. Vaccine. And the way it works is they've taken a cold virus that isn't a human virus, it actually affects chimpanzees normally. It's called a chimp adenovirus, and they have removed from that virus some key genes which are effectively the firing pin for the gun. So this virus cannot grow in our cells. It's so-called replication defective. But what they have done is to put in there instead some of the genetic information that codes for the outer coat of coronavirus. So when this virus is injected into the body, it can get into your cells like a Trojan horse. It delivers the message for what coronavirus looks like, but it's basically a dud virus. It can't grow. It can't make more baby viruses. And this is a tried and tested technology, and they have got some initial data that suggests it makes quite a good immune response of both antibodies and white blood cells, and both arms of the immune response are important in fighting off viruses. That's great. But the problem is that kind of tool needs to be very carefully handled with a fridge, therefore what we call a cold chain, because it will perish. If you get that out of the fridge and keep it in poor conditions for any duration in time, it will just fail. And so if you go to a country where, I mean, there are lots of countries, there are 54 countries in Africa, and I go to Africa quite a bit under normal circumstances, and it's not uncommon for the power to go off 3 times during a meeting. If that's happening to your fridge and the temperature's 35 degrees, your vaccines are going to perish pretty quickly. And then you try and sling them on a Land Rover and drive them to the middle of nowhere. It's just not going to work. So the vaccines that we're making for this country, we're not going to be robbing from the poor to give to the rich, and a reverse Robin Hood sort of immunological equation here. It's going to be different horses for different courses, and people are actively pursuing other solutions that will be very, very useful and very deployable into third world settings. And those things are going on in parallel. We don't have a contest here where we're robbing from one to give to the other. Everyone's working on this all at once, and all this knowledge is valuable, because it may be that the vaccines that we give to the majority of people in the UK, some people won't be able to have those, and so having other options available will also be very valuable. So I think everyone is working together on this, and ultimately there will be a situation where we've got to get this to as many people as possible, and that does mean potentially we've got to make 16 billion doses of vaccine, because we may well need to give people more than one shot. Probably will.
It's turned into a bit of a vaccine special, but I want you to listen to something else here. This is this whole Russian health ministry story. They say that they've got a registered vaccine. It's gone into production. They're going to roll it out later this month. I want you to have a listen to what President Putin had to say. Here you go.
Она работает более точно, формирует стойкий антительный и клеточный иммунитет. Я это тоже хорошо очень знаю, поскольку одна из моих дочерей сделала себе такую прививку. Я думаю, что в этом смысле она поучаствовала в эксперименте после первого укола.
Chris, sorry, you just fade that.
Oh, да, конечно.
Spent all our budget on you, but I just wanted to hear. You might speak Russian. I don't know. He's talking about.
Yeah. What he was saying is, I do actually. What he was saying is, no, I'm kidding.
So basically,
I have watched this press conference, and it's very intriguing. And Vladimir Putin has not only managed to persuade his scientists to invent this vaccine, and well ahead of everybody else, he has also invented a time machine or a crystal ball, or possibly both. Because one of the things he said in that press conference was, and this will give you immunity for 2 years. Now, how on earth does he know that? They've only just made the thing. They've no idea what its effects are going to be. And I actually phoned up a friend of mine, Gordon Dugan, who's a vaccinologist, an award-winning vaccinologist. He's just got the Sabin Medal for Sabin invented the polio vaccine, of course. And Gordon Dugan is a world award-winning vaccinologist at the University of Cambridge. And I phoned him up and asked him his thoughts last week on this, because I was a little bit perturbed about what I was watching, and he said we're very, very alarmed, because this is basically cutting corners left, right and centre in order to achieve in the time that they have what would normally take a very, very long time. We're already on a very accelerated timescale to try to make vaccines in this country. They have shaved off an enormous amount of time, the only way they could possibly have done reason. Now, it might be that this vaccine works, and it works a treat, and good luck to them. 20 countries have said they want to commission 1 billion doses. That was one of the other things he was saying in that press conference. 1 billion doses people have commissioned off of him, he says. Now, if that works, wonderful. But if it doesn't work, there is an enormous risk here of provoking what we call vaccine hesitancy, which is where when a vaccine or an illness gets a bad name attached to it, a sort of bad smell then follows it round. And it means people are much more risk averse in future, a bit like with the MMR scandal. There's no evidence that MMR is linked to any kind of adverse outcome, but the reason we've lost our measles vaccine elimination status in this country and many other countries around the world now, and we have record levels of measles circulating, is because vaccine levels fell through the floor. There's a very real risk if they get this wrong, they will tarnish the brand for all other products, and as a result, we may be then having to live with the consequences of COVID for even longer.
And unlike politicians when it came to MMR, which is like, well, I don't have to say whether I gave it to my kid or not. He's out openly saying, in fact, in that clip, he's given his daughter the vaccine already.
Well, no, this is the interesting thing. He's got two daughters. One's a medical student, a medic, and the other one's a dancer.
And I don't know Russian, but I think the former said, "No way, Jose."
One of them got it, the other one didn't. Now, is this Vladimir Putin doing a control experiment? It's like one daughter the control and one's the recipient. And he didn't say he'd had it though, did he? Which was interesting. He's given it to his daughter. Well, my daughter's had it.
You don't need it when you can wrestle bears with your bare hands.
Well, this is true. He's put himself in isolation though. He's eschewing contact. With what I've read about how he's conducting affairs in the Kremlin, he's eschewing contact with anybody. And,
I don't care where the vaccine comes from, as long as it comes. If they did invent something in the right way, through the right safety procedures, and we could all buy it and have it, great. But it's as you say, it just makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, the UK have said we're not having it. Yeah, I mean we've said owing to the fact that there is this risk. And the international community are saying that this is bad practice, and we are not going to endorse bad practice by taking on board a vaccine that has been manufactured not following safe, sound practice.
So, over 100,000 people signed up for vaccine trials. Let's become the vaccines. Let's do it. Who cares, right? We write our own rules at this time of night. Over 100,000 people have signed up for vaccine trials. That's a phenomenal response. And obviously, it's going to get it because it has all our attention. It's our main story every day. Whether we're talking about A-levels, we're talking about coronavirus. We're talking about holidays, we're talking about coronavirus. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about coronavirus. Is that encouraging, but more needed, I believe?
The problem we've got is that because the levels now in this country post-lockdown of circulating virus are really low, there's something like 700 cases to 1,000 cases per day. Now you might say, well, that sounds like quite a lot. Actually, in a population of 65 million, which we are, it's not prevalent enough that when you do a controlled trial, you're going to get enough infections in your controls to prove that your vaccine works. So let me explain. The way they've done this in this country, for example, is they've recruited a big group of people and randomised them, and no one knows what they're getting, but half of them are going to get the real deal, the experimental COVID vaccine. The other half will get a meningitis vaccine that has no impact against coronavirus. It's serving as a control. You then follow up these people and you see down the track if there's an excess number of people who have caught coronavirus in your control group compared with the non-control group, the intervention group, and if so, that proves that the vaccine must be working. That it relies on there being enough virus circulating in society to get enough infections in the control group to prove and be statistically comfortable that it's really working. So that's why they've now extended this to Brazil and also to South Africa. There are trials going on there as well because they have a higher circulating prevalence, and this means the likelihood of encountering enough infections in your control group to prove statistically that this works. That's what they're hoping to do. But yes, it's certainly kind of good news that we've got low levels of virus, but bad news for the vaccine trial.
Yeah, so it has to go elsewhere. Let me do some random things based on the message. And stories of it lasted 2 weeks and it wasn't there after 2 weeks, and you've already talked about this. Putin saying something can protect you for 2 years is ridiculous. Talk to me about antibodies and where we're at in terms of the science on it right now in relation to COVID-19.
The most recent developments have been that we've seen the results that the government have published from their snapshot. So they've tested a pool of people across society, hopefully representative of the country as a whole, and this has enabled them to extrapolate from that survey to the country as a whole and estimate roughly what fraction of the population, based on them having antibodies, have currently had coronavirus. This shows that about 5 to 10%, and in some cases up to 20%, depending upon geography and also on the sort of work that people are doing, have had the virus. But that means that on average, we're talking 95% of countries like the UK have not had, the 95% of the population have not had it. And what that tells you is that if you give it the opportunity, it will come roaring back with a flourish, a bit like we were in March. We'll see accelerated spread again. So that's why people need to remain cautious, especially if you're at risk, because you could pick this up and you know that would cause potential problems for you.
And the
other thing that people are discussing... Sorry, Colin.
No, go ahead.
Well, the other thing that people are talking about is, well, what's the immune response to catching COVID?
Yes.
How reliable is this antibody response that we're documenting, and what happens when we give people these vaccines? Will that similarly produce a long-lived or a short-lived response? And at the moment, the jury is out, because obviously we can't speed up time. So we have to let the clock tick at the rate that time passes in order to do these sorts of follow-up studies to see if people lose those antibodies or if they're sustained. And similarly, people responding to vaccines, how long will those antibodies persist? Do they continue to protect a person indefinitely or not? And the other uncertainty is, well, even though a person may not register an antibody response in one of these tests, are they potentially nevertheless still immune? Because a study from Sweden has suggested that we've overlooked, or in going on about antibodies, we're overlooking the other key element of the immune response, which is white blood cells, the T cells that fight off virus infections. And some people might not register a detectable level of antibody, but that's because they had a very powerful T cell response against the virus, and we're not testing for that, and therefore we're missing it. So it may be that more people have had it, or it might be that more people are much more immune to it than we currently believe.
Хотя если он и так не откроет, ну тогда я в сам город заеду. Да, так и сделаем.
I've got 3 specific things to talk about in 6 minutes, so keep that in mind, Doctor. So they'll go wherever they go for messages sent in. Can you find out what a shielding mother with 3 children of school age is supposed to do when her children return to school, and they can very possibly bring the virus back to her? Obviously a little bit rhetorical and very worried about that. So a shielding mother.
Very tricky situation. The way that I would approach that is to say that, let's imagine day one back at school. Day one back at school, risk is very low. The reason risk is very, very low is because there's very low levels of virus circulating in society. So at that point, nothing to worry about. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's an outbreak in that school. At that point, I think there needs to be a plan in place for what does someone in that situation do. If you've got an outbreak in the school and there's evidence of the virus spreading where that individual's children may have had contacts, at that point you might have to make a decision about if the school hasn't already been closed, because that might be happening under those circumstances, bringing those children out of school for a period of time while the contacts are sorted out and then they return. Also, the other things being advocated is extremely rigid sort of testing, scrutiny of anyone with any symptoms, very rapid testing, and then isolation of contacts and testing of contacts as well. So it's really all about the surveillance and being mindful and vigilant for if any virus signs there is movement of the virus in that school or that community. Under those circumstances, you then have a plan in place for what you're going to do to react until you know what the risk is. If the risk turns out to be very low and it was just a false alarm, you carry on business as usual. If not, then you take steps to keep yourself protected while that's dealt with.
The sacrifice of that. I don't know whether I should read this out, because he describes you as he describes you as a breath of fresh air in a cloudy funk of COVID misinformation. It's beautifully worded. Can you ask Doctor, I'm going to try and get that to catch on. Can you ask Doctor about long COVID? So this texter, I don't know, male or female, call them they, still suffering 5 months later, got COVID in March. How bad can long COVID get? How long can it typically last, if there's anything typical about this infection? So, I mean, got it in March and is still feeling bad now.
Do you know, amazingly, the programme we put in to 5 Live Science on Sunday, and you always accuse me of bigging up my programmes. We genuinely did make a programme, a whole programme, and it's called, what did I call it? We called it Sick of COVID, The Long Haulers. We put that out on 5 Live on Sunday morning. If you go to, in fact, if you go to the Naked Scientist website, it's on the front page right now, thenakedscientist.com, you'll see Sick of COVID, The Long Haulers. You can download that whole episode. We do take a series of case studies. We've talked to patients. We talk to a GP who's dealing with people who have got these symptoms. We talk to an immunologist who's trying to understand why this is happening. And we talk to a pathologist who's also looking at how the virus is affecting other organs and the immune system probably is affecting those organs, to produce the interesting cloud and constellation of bizarre symptoms that people are complaining of. This appears to be a very real phenomenon. We think it's an inflammatory, a post-infectious inflammatory state. So the virus, in some people, we don't know how to identify who's at risk yet because it's across the age spectrum, it's across the sort of other profiles, male, female, different ethnicities. It doesn't seem to take any prisoners, it's just a random smattering of people. There must be something that connects them, but we haven't found out what yet. But the virus goes in, it seems to throw a switch in the immune system, the virus exits the premises and may even have caused just trivial symptoms but of acute COVID, but then these immunological footprints are left behind, which then translate into these long-term symptoms of very profound fatigue, muscle aches and pains, neurological symptoms including pins and needles, weakness, mental fogginess.
He's got loads of these fungal infection, still getting loss of taste.
In addition to things like the anosmia, loss of smell and taste, and parosmia, people also getting this bizarre thing where when their smell and taste comes back, it doesn't come back right, and it comes back with them having a real finding some foods revolting. Things they used to love, they're saying they are revolting to eat. This is called parosmia, and it appears to be because the smell and taste system has been damaged by the virus, and in repairing itself, as it recovers, it doesn't recover quite right. So it's a bit like recovering while wearing tinted glasses, so you see the world as all the wrong colours to start with. We're learning so much about this virus, but at this stage, this long haul symptoms, very, very real. Have a listen to that programme, and we're happy to answer any questions if you've got them off the back of giving it a listen. If you'd like to write to me afterwards to chris@thenakedscientist.com.
What a service, brilliant. Thenakedscientist.com, have a look at that, and you get a whole programme on it. I want to read this out before we go from James in Dalston. I would agree a lot with what Chris Smith has just said. This was a while ago. Chris mentioned meeting his wife at university. He was deferred a year, you weren't accepted the first year, etc., etc. Without that, you wouldn't have met your wife. I met my late. She passed away in 2007, and they counselled me and helped me through trying times. Universities are more than just about teaching. That's from James in Dalston. Thanks for sending it in. I love the fact that you feel that you can send that into this programme. That is humbling that you would send that in and share that with us, and that we could read it out. So thank you very much. Dr. Chris Smith, enlightening as always. Half an hour is never enough for you. And we do this every couple of weeks. We'll just throw everything out there, let people get their questions and update people, because every time I talk to you, I feel like I've been re-educated. I feel like I've topped up my knowledge, and knowledge
more light at the end of this tunnel. We'll be a bit closer to the light at the end of the tunnel, a bit more to update you on.
You will lead us there. Thank you, Dr. Chris Smith. Really appreciate that. Coming up next is our first ever midnight in America. We'll do it at 12 o'clock every Monday night. All things American, but between now and November 3rd, so much about the US elections, and it's the Democratic Convention tonight in Wisconsin, mostly on Zoom mainly. We're going to hear Michelle Obama's speech and have some amazing guests next.
Digital, BBC Sounds, smart speaker and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
With the BBC News at midnight, this is Jason Kay. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has admitted the algorithm used to calculate A-level grades in England produced significant inconsistencies, and announced that pupils can have their marks predicted by teachers instead. The change will also apply to this Thursday's GCSE results. Mr. Williamson has apologised for any distress caused. But our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, says many people, including some backbench MPs, won't be very forgiving of the government's handling of this particular crisis.
Ministers, of course, dealing with unprecedented situations. In many cases, the evidence changes. They sometimes do have to change what they're doing. But this U-turn is dramatic and it does feel different. And that's because I think many people think you could have seen it coming. Exams in England were cancelled months ago, so they did have a very long time to prepare for this, and still it seems to have gone wrong.
Universities have called for urgent clarification from the government about how the U-turn affects pupils who initially missed the grades required for their first-choice course offer. The Russell Group, which represents 24 leading institutions, says the changes created uncertainty about capacity and risks undermining the student experience. Kent County Council says it can't so safely care for any more child migrants following a rise in the number arriving alone having crossed the English Channel. The authority says the responsibility should be shared across England. 2 men have been charged in the cold case murder of Run DMC's Jam Master Jay. The hip-hop artist's death in October 2002 is one of New York's most notorious unsolved crimes. Prosecutors allege that Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington killed the musician in a drug dispute. Nada Tufik reports.
Jam Master Jay, whose real name is Jason Mizell, was inside his recording studio in Jamaica, Queens at the time of the shooting in October of 2002. Prosecutors say at approximately 7:30 at night, the suspects entered the studio carrying firearms. Ronald Washington allegedly ordered everyone inside to lie on the ground, after which Carl Jordan Jr. is accused of shooting J Master Jay once in the head at close range, killing him at the age of 37. Both men will appear in court to answer the charges against them.
Democrats in the United States are preparing to open their virtual convention, at which Joe Biden will be formally selected as their candidate for November's presidential election. The speakers tonight include the former First Lady Michelle Obama and the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who'd been Mr. Biden's main rival for the nomination. In football, the former Everton and Southampton manager Ronald Koeman is said to be named the new head coach of Barcelona. The Spanish club sacked Quique Setién following their 8-2 defeat against Bayern Munich in the Champions League quarter-finals. The journalist and Spanish football expert Guillem Balaguer said that the appointment of Koeman appears to have been rushed.
Да, я знаю, что я нарушаю правила, но если тут все соблюдать, на это уйдет вдвое больше времени, чем на это уходит так. А на это и так уходит достаточно времени. Так что я отключил давай матери все эти штрафы за нарушение правил. Потому что штрафовать и in real life всегда успеют. Это я поехал по проложенному маршруту. Я так понимаю, что... Ладно, пока не доехал до конца, ничего говорить.
Doesn't sound like fun to me, but yeah, you're right.
5 Live Breakfast, back tomorrow from 6.
Welcome back, everybody. This is the Colin Murray Show on your BBC Radio 5 Live, and every Monday at exactly this time.
Colin Murray.